Hi, this is Paul. I wanted to pick up and do more commentary on the egregores, mobs, and demons video with Pageau and Hall and Vervaeke. I just touched on some of the first parts of it, but this whole video I found quite fascinating. And why do I find it well, let me back up a little bit and talk about this subject. A couple of things. Why are people interested in egregores? I think it's because, as Jonathan Pageau noted, now at the recession of modernity, people are now much more able to see that there are agents, beings at work through us, above us, below us, in the world that we do not control. Part of the comfort of the Enlightenment view was that it left no agents in the world apart from ourselves, and that enlivened in us the hope that we could be masters of the universe. This is the same hope that moved Adam and Eve in the Genesis story. This is the same hope that is, in a sense, motivated by the fact that we have eternity in our hearts. And this is the ambition and hope that we can somehow remake the world in our image. This runs under Game B conversations. This runs under the Paul Kingsnorth, Mary Harrington conversations about trying to remake the world. This ambition is very much an Enlightenment. Well, it's before the Enlightenment, but the Enlightenment sort of breathes new life into it. And now, as we increasingly see, number one, that this effort is futile, number two, that we are not alone, and number three, that so often the things that we do with our hands brings us misery and not the glory and joy and utopia that we imagine we want. Well, suddenly our eyes are open to other spiritual, John Vervaeke will call them hyper agents, other forces in the world. Now, to get an understanding of these forces is very difficult for us, partly because we have gone through the Enlightenment. We are in modernity, even though it's receding, and we're not at all exactly sure of what we're dealing with. And I think part of why we're so interested in this is that, well, suddenly we hope that, well, maybe through some practices, through some procedures, we can get a handle on these things and use these things to achieve our own hubristic vision of, once again, controlling the world. It is that desire that is behind magic. It is that desire that is behind witchcraft. It is that desire that is behind all sorts of attempts at spiritualisms to gain power over others and even ourselves in order to achieve what we think we want. Now, the problems, as I've said in many videos, is that we don't even know what we want. We can't even adequately describe the good. We usually, as Chesterton notes, just describe it as the opposite of the evil we're trying to escape. But the good is surprisingly difficult for us to talk about, surprisingly difficult for us to portray. Now, I think this conversation makes great leaps, not only in terms of just having an honest conversation about this, but I think also in looking for a conversation that shines the light on this. And I think, especially in John Vervaeke, we find someone who's really wrestling with these ideas and wrestling with the implications. And I think along the way, because he's coming at this not from a Christian perspective, but from an outside the church perspective, that some of what he's seeing and articulating is difficult for those of us within the church to see and articulate for them, because we already in some ways have a language that is contextualized within the church, and we all sort of agree to elements of it and understand it and use it. But part of my whole effort throughout the history of this channel has been to try to be able to communicate with those outside the church in language that perhaps isn't that see, part of the problem with the church is that the church tends to speak Christianese, and there's not necessarily anything wrong with Christianese. It's just that it's an in-house language, and if you want to communicate with people that are not in-house, you're going to need words that they understand, and I think this is part of the helpfulness of this conversation. So let's get going.
There's an inability of parasitic processing, the demonic. I mean, but this is, you know this, Jonathan. This is
now this, of course, John Vervaeke has come up with this idea of parasitic processing, and I have the same problem with some of John Vervaeke's nomenclature and terminology that people outside the church have with the Christianese, which is inside the church. Parasitic processing. Well, what is a parasite? A parasite feeds on its host. Now, at some point, if the parasite gets too strong and the host too weak, the parasite destroys the host, and the parasite then itself dies. And that is an amazing illustration of what John is talking about in terms of the nature of evil. I'm eating a sausage on Friday. I clearly must be Protestant.
Like Dionysus, evil is ultimately totally parasitic on the good, right? It pretends to help its self-existence, but it can't actually play the infinite game. Right?
And this is part of what you see in the Garden of Eden, that the man and the woman want independence from God. They rebel against God. They want to take the world and turn it into their own, but they are not up to the task.
You think of it like in a person in terms of, let's say, a fast binge pattern, right? Where someone is on a diet binge pattern, where someone tries to create a top-down pattern of being in themselves, where they're like, I'm going to lose weight, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. And they make it so strict that the opposite happens, because a parasitic process sets itself up. Then you find yourself at 2 a.m. eating a tub of ice cream, and it's like that is, and you know it's destroying you, but it's like there's something else taking over your will.
Right.
Yeah.
Because what's happened is, instead of a dynamic, right, between bottom up and top down, you're getting a vacillation. You get the top down, right, the Kafkaesque, and then you get the bottom up explosion of impulsivity. That's the big.
And notice how how devoid of nuance John is. You know, not John. John is expressing the lack of nuance in and I mean, that's John's exactly right. And you're not getting this reciprocal dance, which is, you know, very much what the story in the Garden of Eden is all about. God places the man and the woman in the garden, and he's looking for a reciprocal dance between himself, his creation, and the man and the woman. It's in itself, in some ways, you know, 3 parts. It's God the creator, our sister nature, and humanity. And they are all to work together to develop the potential. A little bit later, Jordan Hall's going to talk about develop the potential that is in creation.
Binging, I lose all agency, and then right, and you're getting that going back, and that's typically what's happening in parasitic processing.
So it comes up for me there, and I'm noticing 2 things. One is, how do I say this right? Symbolically, I heard John reference the notion of changing the game. Mm-hmm. And so that landed for me was perhaps a orientation or an invitation to shift the game that we're engaging in. And I noticed that I felt something, how do I say, strong perhaps, or a certain clarity when Jonathan was orienting us in the direction of the mythological. So part of the invitation, I would say, is to shift more into a mythological, poetic, artistic, religious, mystic mode. Okay, the other one that came up as I was myself doing that was the word golem came in. And it spoke to something like there's a kind of part in humans, we might call this the mind or the ego, that has as one of its characteristics both a capacity and in some sense a propensity to take itself as the whole. So this is that thing where you don't actually have relationship with proper relationship with wholeness. And I'm wondering if this is that delicate balance of the four-cornered field. The Scylla and Charybdis on either side of that very delicate balance. But actually it takes itself and presents itself as representing the whole, but in fact it certainly can't. And this is what gets you in real trouble. Like that feels like the two sides of the coin. Like one side of the coin is the real actuality of the lived delicate balance of relationship with the actual lived whole. And I'm not sure if this is a commonplace thing. I think it may in fact be a precisely human thing, but we'll see. The challenge or the risk of a particular aspect of human wholes, again, I'll say things like mind and ego, that will endeavor to present themselves as in fact actually being a whole. And therefore
and I think he's right. And I think what he's basically talking about is idolatry. Part of why I was so excited about this conversation is because what I hear from Jordan and John, and I think what Jonathan is hearing in the conversation is again this evolution of language by which now in the recession of modernity, those coming out of it are beginning to reawaken to the Christian world that birthed modernity, but they're not seeing the church and some of these aspects, but they're seeing, I think, some of the foundations
in the way, right? And this is that sort of mob problem, like the demonic capacity, something like that. So there's a bunch of things there that maybe we can play with.
Well, there's definitely, let's say, in the image of the demonic hierarchy, you have the devil as pride being the sin of the devil. That is there. The idea is that what the devil says is, I am God, right? I am God. And so comes into conflict with the whole because he wants to be the totality of all things in himself, let's say, and not part.
Now this pride, it's interesting. Jordan noted in his rather angry screed, the Twitter ban video, that, again, pride is something which has sort of done a 180. It is Pride Month, Pride Parade, the transformation of pride from a negative to a positive, and I think it has some of that self-sufficiency in. There's certain aspects of things that you don't really get around.
Participate in something bigger than him, and that is what leads to the two. So in terms of what we're talking about, in terms of the flip between one side and the other, Saint Maximus, the confessor, talks about sins of the right hand and sins of the left hand, and he says the first sin is always the sin of the right hand. That is, it's pride, self-sufficiency, all of these types of sins. And then those secretly lead to sins of the left hand, which are, passions falling apart, all these thoughts that you can't control. And so you have this movement from one to the other, but it is rooted in the idea of not, let's say, a being not participating in a greater whole, but wanting to just exist as itself, like as this kind of self-perpetuating thing.
So that, I think this is a good move, because participating, like, what's the participatory relationship, right? And so, Levinas makes the famous distinction between totality, which is what the bureaucracy is trying to do, or what the passion is trying to do also, and infinity. And right, and so the totality is the idea that this can be grasped, this can be closed upon.
And totality in that sense is always limited. It's a whole, but it's a closed whole. And infinity is an open whole, WHOL. It is, and again, getting into some of the Christian debates, there's all this skepticism about our participation in infinity, but that's exactly what the language of our life in the age to come and our participation in eternity is all about. And we taste it here in the video that I released about Jordan Peterson and the Daily Wire and some of my talk about art. Unless art has the sense of the infinite in it, it evokes infinity and not totality. And I think that's in some ways why so much preacher, I'm not going to say Christian art because so much Christian art is excellent art, but preacher movies are, and even preaching falls flat because it creates, as John noted, this totalitarian totality rather than bearing witness to the infinite and the inexhaustible, which is God.
Right? Whereas the living thing has the proper relationship to infinity in the sense that the living thing has a capacity for evolution that the parasitic processing thing doesn't have. Right? Like this is the sense I'm getting, in fact, from Maximus. I'm reading him right now. If I'll use mythological language as Jordan invited us. If God was to completely remove, he can't, I get it. But if he were, right, and the demons were allowed to run completely free, they would disappear in an instant.
Right? Now, I think in some ways this is what you get with Christian visions of hell. There's always this competition with Christian images and visions of hell. Look at the images that are in the New Testament. A lake of fire. It's consuming that which no longer has anything to consume. The book of Exodus, of course, says, God is a consuming fire. Well, evil, and this image that John says is that you get the sense that evil is parasitic to the degree that it just keeps eating itself until there's nothing left of it. And if God completely withdraws, well, what that is, in fact, the definition of hell. It is the absence of God. And in that sense, hell is both infinite eating, okay? Weeping and gnashing of teeth. Gnashing of teeth is almost eating without food. And you have where the worm never dies, and so it's eating. And so is hell existent? Yes, infinitely so, but sort of the opposite of infinity, because it just keeps eating itself. And without God, and so is it zero? Well, sort of. And when you get to the ends of these things, a lot of our talk of existence gets very weird. And you have that sort of on both sides, but evil has nothing finally but its own misery to continue to try to consume. And that is, again, a vision that's so horrible that anyone who is attempting to put an image on it is going to struggle.
Right? Because they would reciprocally narrow to nothing. They don't actually, they do not have a capacity. In fact, the defining feature of them, I would put it to you, is they're incapable of evolution. They're incapable of, right, that movement that is constitutive of life, which is the participation in infinity without ever claiming to have a totality. And so the thing I see in the mob is exactly that feature, right? It may be self-perpetuating, and so therefore it's different than the pure egregore, but it can't evolve. Or I would put it this way, if it starts to evolve, it precisely ceases being a mob and becomes a proper hyper agent.
So
right, and just to hold that little piece right there is that there's a that thing I brought in earlier about the fact that we don't want to be confused. So the mob,
Right.
we have a very, very nice term actually. There's a distinction between evolution and development.
Yes.
Development is the exploration of a potential that is already present in a.
And that's exactly what the man and the woman are given in the garden. There's a ton of potential and exploration, and they are told to develop it and fulfill it. Fulfillment is the development of potential. Okay. But obviously, if God takes himself out, if, as C.S. Lewis says, God finally says to those who don't wish him, I'll not bother you anymore, but what comes with me is all being. And so if you don't want me, you have to hate being. Again, one of the things that occurred to me that, when I is being negative? Well, if you're evil, there's a sense in which being is necessary, but it's also negative. All you can do is consume, and that consumption is destruction. It's not development. Is being neutral? That tends to be what the current scientific cosmology wishes to state, that being is neutral. And it's almost always within these neutralities that our hubris rushes in to try to, it's really our evil rushes in to try to develop, colonize, and consume. Or is being finally good? And once you begin from the posture that being is good, that it is not simply chaotic, that it is not illusory, but being is knowable and good, if you keep working this out, I think you will find what Christianity has long asserted. I think that's its outcome. There's an inevitability to a lot of this, I think.
Closed domain.
Yes.
So the mob, in fact, can develop, meaning it has a period of time whereby it can, in fact, expose a novelty that was already imparted into the reality that it was at the moment of its being.
Yes.
Without actually being connected to a wholeness, and therefore is incapable of evolution. Right.
Yes.
And I think what Jordan Hall just said to me also sounds a lot like you have this strange need to justify the continuation of history after the resurrection has begun in the resurrection of Christ. And, well, why? Well, the time isn't full. Well, why? Well, the mob must continue to develop its potential, and while it develops its potential, it will also unleash and reveal other things as they go, but God will call to an end this chapter when God sees that the time is full.
Yes.
Novelty. Yeah. Okay.
Jonathan, doesn't this resonate? I mean, at least in some deep ways. I mean, like I said, I'm doing Lectio Divina on both Dionysius and Maximus right now, and that's right. And I have sections both where they're wrestling with the existence of evil, and they're both making the argument that evil is kind of pure self-destructiveness, and like Jordan says, it has a capacity for development because it's not completely self-existent, although it pretends to be.
Yeah.
Right. But if it was completely unconstrained by the love of God, it would actually completely self-destruct. I don't think I'm imposing that on them when I'm saying
no. I think you're right.
Yeah.
So the way that I like to think about it, at least, would be something like the constituents of an egregore. Let's say they're these parasitic patterns, parasitic structures, but they could have the possibility of being more than what they are. It's just that they aren't. They're looking at themselves, and it's called a devolving because of that. So an addiction is a good example. So every addiction is based on a true desire, which could lead you into something more, but because it closes itself off and then acts as this weird self-existent being, then it becomes parasitical and tends to destroy the higher agent.
So now we have to bring in the notion of selling your soul. Right?
Yeah.
So the addiction captures the actual vitality of a living being.
Yes.
And it enslaves, it whips, right? It drives that living being. It actually will extinguish it. But in the meantime, it will actually tap into whatever degree of evolution that living being actually still has left in it. So if you imagine sort of your classic, let's go with Jim Morrison, somebody who I have a sort of a connection with, a vital genius connected to wholeness in a particular way and ridden by a demon that pushed the being into a self-destructive local optima extraction of what was available in terms of a short-term burning brightness that generated an energetic flow of capacity that was extracted by the demon until, of course, the underlying host died, at which point the demon also evaporates, or in this case, has to find a new host.
Find a new host.
Yeah. And many of us may in fact be associated with that. So there's a very interesting, now we're getting to a very interesting place to begin exploring what that looks like.
But I think you're right. The idea of selling your soul that's exactly what it is. It's like, I mean, you could say that every time that you see a good in itself, or that you try to attach yourself to a good in itself that isn't leading you to better, higher goods, that isn't placing you in a system of higher goods, let's say, then you are somewhat selling your soul, or you're letting your soul be captured by something which will feed off of it.
Anytime you profane the sacred, you're selling your soul.
Yeah, and so you can understand, like, it's a country, for example, could have that problem where they get caught up in one specific aspect of what it is to be a country, and then they kind of revolve around that, and then it captures the soul of the country. So, and then it can end up just devouring it. I think you saw that in
there's perhaps the same relationship here as there is in Jordan Peterson's nomenclature between an ideology and a religion. As John noted, the life has within it the mark of the infinite, and in a sense, that the image of the telos of the infinite. And in other words, it finally continues to seek the infinite that gave it life, and the infinitude that it participates in is crucial to its nature, while the parasite does not have that in the same way.
Communist countries. And I think you probably see it now. Let's say in America, you can see how entertainment has become, let's say, this massive, weird parasitic thing that is devouring everybody's attention, and is in some way blinding them to higher goods in which they can participate. It's kind of capturing the soul of even a country. And there are different forms of that, I think.
So is the demonic in this sense? Sorry, I will. You two can keep exploring the mythological. I'll try and play that game, but I keep coming back to the biological. Maybe we're trying to actually get bios and mythos and logos to talk to each other here. The metaphor that's coming to mind for these kinds of things is like a virus, like that, right? Although viruses can evolve, so that's where the analogy breaks down. But I'm trying to get almost something like a computer virus is what I want, that can infect and spread and replicate, but it's completely dependent, asymmetrically dependent, but it can't ever become a bona fide, program that does anything useful in the world. 'Cause I'm trying to get at, right? The reason I bring it up is because there's a real debate, and I don't mean like just academics doing their typical hair splitting. There's a real debate about whether or not viruses have agency. That's why I'm bringing up that as the analogy, because and there's a real debate about whether or not they're actually alive, precisely because they're sitting on that boundary, right? right between, right? They sit right on this gray line between agency and non-agency, and between living and non-living. And I feel like we're wrestling with a deeply analogous problem with the demonic, or whatever we want to call this middling thing, is right. Is it perhaps also that, because for me, the notion of hyper agency, I think, is very well developed. And I think the notion of aggregation is very well developed. You can, cybernetic systems, et cetera, right? But this intermediary thing, it seems like it's difficult for us, precisely because it's falling between the living and the non-living, the agentic and the non-agentic, like a virus, right? And I'm just wondering if we're struggling because we are bringing categories to bear on it that it definitionally eludes, right?
No, I think you're right, but I think that your understanding of in between is extremely important.
Right.
Again, if I bring about the image of the chimera, like the way that the chimera is represented, the demon is represented as a chimera. And so this is the in-between space. This is the problem of the in-between space, the problem of transitions, right? All this issue. And so I think that this is what the virus represents. By the way, John, you know that Jacques Derrida, in a famous interview, said that everything that he's ever done is about a virus. Everything that he's ever done is about virology, because exactly of that point, which is that the virus is a mal vivant. The virus is a living dead. It's like a zombie in a way, this in between character. Because and then when we focus on it, it tends to deconstruct the identities. It tends to actually kind of devour parasitically the different identities that it's attached to.
Yes, I had forgotten that, but I thank you for reminding me. I was thinking of Burroughs, that language is a virus from outer space. I was thinking of, which was, I guess, is very Derridian also. But thank you for that. Yeah, that I did know that, but I had forgotten that. That's a fantastic remembering. Yes.
There is. So I think that one of the reasons why we're seeing this now is that on the one hand, we have a system, let's say a system of control of information, which is the internet, which is also the states moving into things like digital identity and digital control. So we have these systems happening. So we can notice this top-down thing that is coming down strong. But at the same time, we also have this deconstructive mode in the culture, this idea of destroying, of breaking down identities, of these parasitic behaviors. And so I think that it's those two extremes happening at the same time are possibly the thing that is making people able to perceive these hyper agents again, which, because you can see they're pressing down on us. We can kind of see it happening in a way that, because you think, like, who controls Twitter, for example? It's like, well, no one actually controls.
Who controls Twitter? What does Jordan say at the end of this thing?
Well, trying to use, understand, and master that horrible, toxic platform. No doubt I owe some apologies for that, and I'm trying to learn. But it's a relief, in some real sense, to be banned. And I regard it, under the present conditions, as a badge of honor.
And then Jordan Peterson Uncensored, now on Daily Wire Plus. What will be the end of that? But Pageau's point here is so interesting, that we're caught on the one hand between this spirit of deconstruction that he connects with Derrida, and also this spirit of control. And because it's not just always control, and it's not always deconstruction, it's both, and they're aligned. And in some ways, it's sort of as Pageau has used before, it's sort of the whore riding the beast. Now, one is going to consume the other, and so we see now much more clearly this battle that is going on, as the New Testament would say, in the heavenlies.
Twitter. They get taken up by these ideological things that come back down, but it's not, you couldn't point to one person and say this person controls, let's say, the narrative right now. It's happening organically for sure.
But that was always the case. To my point, language is a virus from outer space. That was always the case for language. Nobody controls it. Nobody runs it. There's nobody in charge of it yet, but it evolves and it changes and it has a life of its own in powerful ways.
And we're all subject to it.
We're all asymmetrically dependent on the languages that we know, right, in powerful ways.
I think the point Jonathan's making is something like, because we're in a moment where a whole category of hyperagents are in the process of dying inelegantly, it's easier to notice that that's what's happening. Right? The bunny is no longer just sort of it's no longer maybe sleeping. Like the rot has set in quite significantly. There's a sort of certain stench and a certain awareness that if you touched it, maybe something bad would happen to you. Right? You don't want to eat it anymore. It's definitely not a healthy thing to be connected with. Simultaneously, the game is afoot to see what new kinds of hyperagents might want to step in and integrate us so neatly into their body. And so both,
again, if you just listen to Jordan Hall, this language is very at home in the New Testament, that these principalities and powers would have us and do have us to a degree, but then in Christ, another spirit comes and possesses us. And this again just draws me right back to C.S. Lewis's the Screwtape Letters. This from the Screwtape Letters. To us, a human is primarily food. To the principalities and powers, our aim is the absorption of its will into ours, the increase of our own area of selfhood at its expense. We are the matter that they are consuming. But the obedience which the enemy demands, of course, the enemy is God, because the Screwtape Letters is written in reverse, of men is quite a different thing. One must face the fact that all the talk about his love for men and his service being perfect freedom is not, as one would gladly believe, mere propaganda, but an appalling truth. He really does want to fill the universe with a lot of loathsome little replicas of himself. Loathsome, of course, the purview of the demons. Creatures whose life on its miniature scale would be qualitatively like his own, not because he has absorbed them, which is, of course, what the parasite wants to do to digest, but because their wills freely conform to his. We want cattle who can finally become food. He wants servants who can finally become sons. We want to suck in. He wants to give out. We are empty and would be filled. He is full and flows over. Our war aim is a world in which our Father below has drawn all beings into himself. The enemy wants a world full of beings united to him, but still distinct. Screwtape Letters, page 46.
The sort of decaying dead body of the hyperagents of the past, sort of collapsing Titanic-like into the ocean and maybe pulling us down with them, is present very viscerally. As are all the various kinds of the previous simplicities of the ways that you would go about solving basic problems in life, like going to the grocery store, are no longer obvious and simple. And so shit's fucked up and you have to think about it. Oh shit, I have to think about it. What's happening? Oh, and it kind of pushes the mind into a greater and greater awareness of what's happening. And because this novelty is there, there's both an awareness of the moment of, geez, if we don't make choices in a certain direction, then we'll be brought into a new kind of thing, probably kicking and screaming. And also, well, now's the time. Right? If we would like to have something be slightly different, you couldn't have done it in 1977. There was no chance of that, but now you can, because the space of transition is upon us, that kind of thing. So I think those are bringing into the surface this awareness, and the mythopoetic is activating it within us, say, hey guys, this is sort of one of those times.
I agree with that. I think that's a good point. So thank you for that. I guess I would want to say that the point I was trying to bring out, I think, is then needs to be brought into proper relation, which is I wanted to indicate that it has always been the case that there have been things that nobody's in charge of, language, culture, etc., etc., and that we have lost a cognitive cultural grammar in order to talk about them. That is also part of the problem. I agree with you, Jordan. You know I do. That we are now in a time of accelerating rate of complexification. I like this almost mythological idea of hyper agents becoming zombies, right? This is a term actually used of certain distributed cognitive systems, right? Like the zombies in between, the viral entities, and they're infecting us, and that makes us aware of them. But I also think we've lost a way of talking and thinking.
Now, this lostness again brings me back to C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image, in that the project of the classical period and the project of the medieval period was there to afford us ways of talking and conceptualizing and participating and living into, and that was destroyed by a whole series of things. It started before the Protestant Reformation, the Columbian Exchange, the Enlightenment. All of those were part of this movement in which that image was destroyed, and in a sense it had to be destroyed because there are elements of it that could no longer be sustained because they weren't true enough in all of the different ways that truth needed to be. And so now, as sort of the fever of modernity continues to pass, now we are waking up to realize that there needs to continue to be more integration of, you can't just throw away the classical and the medieval or the modern. It has to be brought together again. But now we're recognizing and seeing the poverty of our language.
And conceiving of hyper agents that is also part of the problem. I think that for many people, and this is no backhanded criticism to Jonathan, who I consider an important friend, right? But for many people, they are not willing to take up the ancient language, the ancient languages. I keep coming back to language as a metaphor here. The ancient languages by which these hyper agents were properly related to. And
again, this relating to is key, because part of what excites people about the egregore conversation and the word, and once they begin to see these hyper agents and these images, are first there's terror. And this is a terror that was pervasive throughout the ancient world and the world until Christianity. And Christianity comes and Jesus has power over the demons. Well, that doesn't just mean what we see in the story of the New Testament. It goes beyond that. And so when the Navajo embrace Christ, Jesus has power over the demons. But that's situated within the Navajo culture, and it was felt and known. And now we have the question that, wow, we're beginning to see demons again. Does Jesus have power over them? And you can see that acted out, let's say, in a Roman Catholic exorcism or in a Protestant Pentecostal exorcism. But we need to know it on a far broader, larger scale, because we're seeing demons at a level that we hadn't noticed them before. And the cultural conflict in some ways is the question, will Christ conquer these demons as well? Be of good cheer, my little flock, because I have overcome the world. Because the world in the Gospel of John it's used in a variety of valences, but the world sometimes in the Gospel of John is negative. And it's that, it's the devil, the world, and our sinful nature. And all of these, the claim is in Christianity that Christ has power over them. Well, how? Well, obviously through the Spirit, through us. But this is going to have to be act it out, and the Spirit is going to have to move through us, and this is going to go through real time and real people, and that's in many ways the Christian story.
And lived with, if I can put, and lived through. And so I don't deny everything you said. That there's something happening here, but I also think there is also an impoverishment on our side of our capacity to enter into a proper receptivity of these entities that is also making everything much worse. Sorry, that ended it very
well. If I wanted to monopolize the game of hyperagency, then I would impoverish the language of humanity.
Yes.
Yeah. And there's also something which I think is happening, which is also part of this, which is that as we notice, I mean, let's be honest, like as we watch Christianity die, let's say, one of the things that's happening is that it's giving the space for these competing hyperagents to appear, like Jordan was talking about. Basically, you have all these beings rushing in and now fighting amongst each other to figure out who's going to take over.
Aren't they all often just zombie Christianities?
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's what I think that what I was coming to is the idea of
they're certainly not all. Let's give the celebrity atheists their due and their argument about the Greeks and the Enlightenment. And it isn't that Christ is all in all, even though he's been dominant in the West and in portions of the East. But there are still many other spirits out there working. But again, zombie Christianities is a really acute way of talking about some of these elements still roaming around in our streets and in our minds.
Antichrist. Like I think that's right. Well, that's what I think that what I was coming to is the idea of Antichrist. Like I think that this is something it seems like Christians had perceived at the outset, that the idea that in the moment of its death, or in the moment that Christianity would fall apart, like there would be this spirit of Antichrist which would appear, which would be a strange remainder, a strange parasitic version of Christianity that would appear and would kind of take over the space. And so even if you look at the like weird neo-pagan type things that are coming in, they're all framed as strangely anti-Christian at the same time. So you, at least in the West, for sure. I mean, I don't know about in other places, but in the West, this is what seems to be happening. But then now, the thing is that now these small little beings are appearing and manifesting themselves, and people are noticing them. And the fact that a lot of people haven't noticed these beings before, let's say, means that now they're fascinated by them. Like they're fascinated by them. Like I think the whole psychedelic thing, a lot of it has to do with that. It's like people, they take these psychedelics, they encounter these intelligences, and they become fascinated no matter what it is that they encounter. They have no way they don't discern these beings that they're encountering. They just encounter them. And there seems to be something of that going on, which is like, if I can have people join these little weird subcultural groups and become extremely passionate about it because they are looking for hyperagency. They're looking for ways to participate in common stories and in common, but there is no way for it to, they all appear as these parasitic things and they're all devouring people's attention. And, whether it be like Star Wars Jedi culture or crazy, political activism, like all of it is the same. It's like these little parasitic processes that are taking up people's attention and driving them towards separation, at least like social division, for sure.
Driving them towards little things and insufficient totalisms.
Sure. We should throw Baudrillard into the mix. We brought his buddy Jacques in. We might as well bring in Baudrillard. We're talking about simulations and simulacra, right?
Yeah.
But I would like to point out maybe two things to help expand. One is, I'll say it's actually two parts of the same thing. I don't know that we are really properly in relationship with the degree to which humans have been living in these sort of dead, decaying, no longer wholesome contexts. I would say something like, and I'm gonna make this proposal.
Right.
I would say something like 98%, 95, 85% of all of history has been the history of human beings being in this game of being like in the mob, meaning the thing, they are not living a living whole being system. They are in fact participating in the development, the exploration of the sort of extraction of the decaying body of something that they're a part of, which lasts hundreds or thousands of years at an arc. So we've been living in a period of momentary eruptions of, guess the word probably is properly spirit in some very specific sense, which then provides a temporary, of course, in a human arc, hundreds of years or thousands of years, temporary sort of body to be slowly decayed. And that as a consequence, we actually get very confused, right? We mistake the game of playing mobster, for the game of actually being in connection with wholesome reality. Because our metaphors and our references are still pulling examples of the same fucking thing, just maybe at a larger scope or a different period of its death. And here I'll call out specifically two guys who I've got a lot of reference to. One is Carol Quigley, and another is Peter Turchin, who talk about the rise and fall of civilizations. And Quigley, I think, did the best job because of the period of time when he was writing, which was, when a civilization is born, let's go with Rome on the Palatine Hills, just barely pushing back against the Celtic invasion. There's a point at which a certain kind of, let's say, codes or generator function, a moment of evolution occurs in a period of absolute crisis. This then creates what he called the expansive principle, that once that is born, there's almost like the whole story of Rome for 1,000 years is locked in at that point. You have this arc through which it deploys, it develops, it explores the space that is born, more or less in a generation. And it expands to the degree to which that expansive principle gives it power, the ability to extract power and concentrate it on itself. It just expands. And of course, it explores the edges and the fringes because it's using human beings as cognitive agents. And it becomes a sort of demonic principle expanding on the backs of those who are brought in more and more and more into the body of Rome. I'm noticing that as a really interesting metaphor, or a mythopoetic, Babylon, right? But it's already dead. Right? There's a point at which it will appear. By the way, Quigley very specifically says, when you think you're in a golden age, you're actually at the point at which you're eating the seed, right? That you're consuming the last vital energy. And then by the time you realize you're in the decline, the civilization is actually passed into the point of its inevitable death. It just may take a while, depending on how much it can continue to consume, right? How much can it eat? How much energy was contained within the reservoir that it staked. And so, if we imagine that that's the story, right? That it's only actually at the edges, right? It's only in moments of true gathering, right? When spirit is present, that the upwelling comes. But for the most part, for the whole of civilization, we've actually been living in dead things. And we've built the mindset of parasitism so deeply into our grammar, into our sensibilities, that we're going to have to be extremely careful not to take a simulation of something that seems like a really good copy of the real thing as the real thing.
It's a very interesting image. There's so much there to sort of think through.
So you've got a version of the fall, to speak mythologically. That
Yes, no.
Right.
But the question is, so Jordan Peterson, the way that he talks about it, he says something like, you're right, that's how it works. But the only way to do it is to go down into the belly of the whale and resurrect your father. Because the problem with the way that you're saying it is that you can't manufacture the Kairos moment that will cause the monumental change. You can't manufacture the moment of expansion. You can't make it up. It's something.
Now, again, kairos, there's these two terms in Greek for time. One is chronos, which is sort of ongoing time. And kairos is that moment of transformation. And in this part of the video, I found really profound. John's about to give a really, I think, a profound speech in here. And what Jonathan Pageau mentions is that you can't manufacture the kairos moment. And so often in this ongoing conversation that we're having in this little corner of the internet with people who want to transform, and so often I bump into people who are, they're getting interested in Christianity. They sense the hunger. They sense the need. They might even be knocking on the door, and they challenge and say, "Didn't you say knock and the door will be opened? Ask, seek, and you will find. Ask, and it will be given to you." Well. You can't manufacture the kairos moment. You can't self-transform. The transformation needs to come from above and work in us. All of the Christian language is like that. Notice the book of Acts, the day of Pentecost, the sound of a rushing wind, tongues of fire, and they are transformed, and the disciples are no longer this hapless bunch you find just kind of trailing along with Jesus, never getting him. Suddenly you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and to the ends of the earth.
Thing which happens in a revelation, you could say. And so until that revelation happens, it seems like, even though maybe what you're saying is right, the only thing to do is to try to breathe life into the forms that have been given to you, because, or else what?
Woo!
Or else,
I disagree.
Or else you have all these like 60s like cults, like you have all these weird.
And this is where Pageau and Stixenheimer 666 got into it, because there's all these attempts to, modern Wiccan. Even then of course scholars looked at that and said, no, witchcraft in the early modern period. You think about Salem, Massachusetts, that witchcraft was deeply Christian in the sense that they used Christian language and Christian imagery. They thought they were sort of, and witchcraft is sort of an overt form of idolatry, where we can initiate the kairos moment. We can deliver for ourselves the transformation, instead of the transformation emanating from above and being a gift given to us that comes down and transforms that which is below and gives into it the vital life of God that, of course, we can't self-generate. We participate in, and that's why, of course, every child that we have is a gift from God. But let's hear Jordan's objection.
Have all these like little,
definitely a bad idea.
So what else then?
All right, you ready?
Go for it, Jordan.
This is fresh, or not fresh. It's ancient. So I was really thinking about this after reading that essay. That was the sort of the precursor to this conversation. Yeah. And I was sort of sitting with, what might Pageau's point of view on the top down emanation, I believe is the term you use.
Yeah.
And the thing that kept coming up for me was a question of creation and the notion of the moment of creation. And I couldn't help but continually find myself in a circumstance where I was taking the perspective. It just showed up for me as obvious that the moment of creation is omnipresent. It is not operating in what would be chronos, right? It's not operating in sort of time as we understand it in that fashion.
Yeah.
And
so he's saying basically the kairos is omnipresent. It's not restricted to chronos.
So the possibility of kairos is always present. One does not manufacture kairos by any stretch of the imagination, but one becomes afforded to the possibility of perceiving.
Well, the kingdom of God is at hand. It's at hand. It's right here. It's and in that way, Jordan's got a point. I don't know that he's disagreeing with Jonathan, but
and playing with the kairos that is always present for what it is. aware what it is, right? And that is sort of the beginning and the end of the story. So you definitely don't try to create a fucking cult, right? But beyond comprehension, a terrible idea.
Yeah.
But simply dancing with the presence of the kairos that is always present is the only ethical, only proper thing to do anyway.
No, but I agree with you. That is, I agree in the sense that I agree that, so the way that I would say it is that the only thing you can do is become a saint. Like that's actually the only thing you can do. The only thing you can do is transform your passions, transform yourself, transform your life, and that then you will become, in a way,
you transform, but you participate in the transformation. You be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Romans 12.
What is it Christ says? Become a tree, and then the bird will land in your branches. But that has to happen. And so I agree. But there are different levels of that. Like there are different levels of kairos. Let's say there are different. I can play that role, but I'm not going to start a new religion, right? I can play that role within the story that has been given to me. And I'm not going. So even, let's say, even if you take, for example, Christ, he's not making a new thing up. What he's doing is he is coming into the Judaic tradition. And then, if you believe what he was and what he said, he's basically breathing life back into it and showing us the brightness of what was there, like kind of giving life to something which was given to him. And so I think that that's the only thing we can do at each of our levels. Like, I think it's the same even with Buddha. Like Buddha didn't make something up. Like he was coming into an ascetic tradition. He looked at the different ascetics and he gathered that in, and then he transformed it or represented it in a way which was full, let's say.
Well, I want to respond to that. I mean, Christianity isn't Judaism and Buddhism isn't Hinduism, right? So there is something that's going on there. I agree with you. We shouldn't be making
This is the speech. I actually made a clip of it, but I didn't post it anywhere. But this was just such a good speech. I had to mark it.
Religion.
And
I agree with you. We shouldn't be making a religion. But
I don't. So a religion that's not a religion. An ecology of practices, and I would, I'm not trying to straw man John or kneecap him or anything, because I think he's being sincere here, that John's a seeker, and he's looking to, I'd say he's looking for God. He's a non-theist, but he's looking. What does he look? Any seeker who wants transformation, who wants to level up, is looking for God. And that would be the Christian terminology for it, of course. Because why? You want to be close to that giver of life. You want to be close to that one who brings kairos. And now the kairos is the day of the Lord, and it's all throughout Scripture, and it's always got both sides. It's, when Christ meets Paul on the road to Damascus, he's blinded and disabled before he's enabled and recreated. I mean, this is that there's always a mortification and a vivification that goes on in the transformation. There's a dying to self and living to Christ. There's a putting off of the old and a putting on of the new. This is what all of that language is about. And yet John's point that Christianity isn't Judaism, and Jacob would certainly agree, and Buddhism isn't Hinduism, and that's true too. Yet Jonathan's point that they don't start from nothing, and that's a good thing, because that way those who are in systems, the systems are connected and related, and there's sufficient bridges and connections between them that, of course, this is what Lewis was so good at, is showing those bridges and connections that you can get there from here.
I'm wondering about, like, part of Morton's point about hyper objects is that they force us into a kairos, right? Like I do think the kairos is upon us, and I thought both of you were saying that earlier. There's a sense in which this,
and that's right. And so with all of the lament and anxiety about the challenges that we find ourselves, there's always also a sort of anticipation that in Christianity, God can use all sorts of catastrophes for his glory. And that's always the double edge of the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians, which is the birth of, in some ways, the visions to Ezekiel and the synagogue, which will permeate the world. The day of the Lord is always a tearing down and a renewal and a building up.
we know that something is changing here, because all of these entities are now, the plausibility of the existence of these entities is now prominent where it was not 20 or even 15 years ago. That seems to me to be an important marker about the fundamental levels of our ontology. So I do think the kairos is upon us.
But we're not going to direct it. Like, I don't think so.
No, we can't. But I agree.
Yeah.
And again, it's in our inability to direct it that the terror comes from people in the Enlightenment, because they were fed the idea that we're in charge. And suddenly we begin to discover that, well, you have democracy. And so, well, now we want to have propaganda and we want to wield it, and we want, we want the reins. We want to control Twitter. And so Zuckerberg creates Facebook, and then he wants to control it. And Congress comes in and says, why can't you control that beast that you made? And well, if I try to control it, I'll kill it. Yeah, so something else is controlling it. And back to Kingsnorth, the machine isn't neutral.
To direct it, that is exactly to confuse. That is exactly to think it's all top down. Neither are we just supposed to passively wait. That's just purely bottom up. We have to figure out the proper proportional participation, and that's what I mean by right. I don't know if we have the language for that right now, for the concepts of it. So one of the things we can do,
and again, he didn't say we don't have the language to control it. We don't have the language to participate in it. And when I think about what we do in church, it's exactly what we're doing. We're bringing, it's prayer, it's adoration, praise, contrition, confession. We're confessing our responsibility in what's going on. It's thanksgiving. It's participating. It's call and response to the source of all life. And then it's supplication. It's asking. And there's a huge difference between asking and participating and controlling or seeking control. And that in many ways is the dividing line between worship and idolatry.
Is concepts of it. So one of the things we can do is, I agree with you like Jordan, I don't disagree with, we've been playing the sort of, the extraction model of civilization, and we can't do that anymore. We're at another kairos, which is we're global, and we can't just have an extraction mentality. So two things are pushing on us, right? We have the advent of the reality of the
what a use of a word,
parasitic entities and the hyper agents. And we have the fact that civilization now encompasses the globe, which it never had before. And so there's no outside. We can't extract and move on. We can't wait, right?
Brett Weinstein has a very interesting old lecture about that sort of that entry into a virgin land. And, this is where the advent of modernity, you have the Columbian Exchange, followed by the Protestant Reformation, followed by the Enlightenment. The colonization of the New World was not incidental to this in terms of what it did to our imaginations, and obviously that played deeply on our imaginations in many, many different ways.
And so for me, like I want to sort of bring it back around to what is it for us to enter into proper relationship with these hyper agents and these parasitic agents, such, right?
And this is right here the religious question. What is proper relationship? And so obviously that is exactly what Jesus is talking about in the Gospels. You have the kingdom of God, and you have the demonic world, and you have Jesus talking about our relating to each other, because obviously we are not only food for the hyper agents sometimes, we are the matter through which the hyper agents are manifesting themselves, and we also have agency. Remember that we ourselves are spiritual beings, and so we are participating in this. So his question right there is in fact the heart of the religious question. I'll play it again.
Hypership is, I want to sort of go, for me, like I want to sort of bring it back around to what is it for us to enter into proper relationship with these hyper agents and these parasitic agents, such, right? Because I mean, I thought that there's a biblical truth here. I thought, yes, we don't direct the kairos, but our decisions matter to the kairos, right?
Sure, yeah.
Right. And so how can we virtuously and with virtuosity participate in the largely virtual medium in which the kairos is presenting itself, so that we can...
I don't know that it's largely virtual, because it's completely governing and colonizing the lower register.
Discover the proper relationship to the emerging ontology, if I can put it that way. That to me is the question. Like I am interested as a scientist in all of these ontological questions, but what comes back to me is, yeah, but
he's a person first, and he's a seeker, and so this is exactly what he's seeking.
And I think this is what Jordan is saying. And I think maybe you're saying it too, Jonathan. We're at a kairos. The kairos is upon us, right? And yes, and I get it. The historical kairos is situated against the eternal kairos, but that's exactly just to put the question: is how do I enter into a proper relationship to this emerging ontology?
It's fundamentally the same question. What must I do to be saved?
So that I can have some trust that I'm being virtuous in relationship to it. I mean, the problem with
and now that, I think, certainly you want that, but you actually want far more than just that. You want to not only be right, you want finally what all of our hearts want, is to have this eternity depth hole filled with the only thing that can fill it, that which itself is infinite and eternal, and that which itself is the source of life. We want nothing less, and which I think modernity has taught us. Again, back to that, I should have just isolated that clip from Jordan. I know I can find it because I made a PowerPoint.
Cores of life are, of course, that everything eats everything else, and that everything dies, and that everything's born, and that the whole bloody place is a charnel house, and it's a catastrophe from beginning to end. And this is the vision of it being other than that. And you know, there's a strong idea. This was also implicit in the alchemical ideas, and I think it's also implicit in the scientific revolution, that human beings can interact with reality in such a way so that the tragic and evil elements of it can be mitigated, and so that we can move somewhat closer to a state that might be characterized, well, that's obviously images.
And in some ways, this is the Jordan Hall says the kairos is always upon us, and in some ways that's right. But it's the negative of the kairos. It's the wrath of God is revealed Romans 1, Romans 1:18.
But it might be characterized by something like that, where we have the benefits of actual existence without all of the catastrophe that seems to go along with it. And Carl Jung, when he wrote about the emergence of alchemy, or the emergence of science from alchemy, he thought of science as being motivated by a dream, because for Jung, the dream was the manifestation of the instincts. It was the boundary between the instincts and thinking. He said, well, science is nested inside a dream. And the dream is that if we investigated the structures of material reality with sufficient attention and truth, that we could then learn enough about material reality to alleviate suffering, right? To produce the philosopher's stone, to make everybody wealthy, to make everybody healthy, to make everyone live as long as they wanted to live, or perhaps forever. That's the goal, to alleviate the catastrophe of existence. And that idea, the idea that mysteries, the solution to the mysteries of life that might enable us to develop such a substance, or let's say a multitude of substances, provided the motive force for the development of science.
And again, you can see in that the distrust from the garden. We don't believe God will give us the kingdom. We don't believe God will give this to us, so we must take it into our own hands and secure it for ourselves. And this is idolatrous.
And Jung traced the development of that motive force really over 1,000 years. And if you're interested in reading his books on alchemy, which are extraordinarily difficult, and that's really saying something about Jung, because all of his books are difficult, and then the books on alchemy, they kind of take a quantum leap. That's actually a very small leap, so I shouldn't say that. They take a massive leap into a whole different dimension of complexity, but that's what he was trying to get at. He went back into the alchemical texts and interpreted them as if they were the dream on which science was founded. And Newton was an alchemist, by the way. I mean, Jung's hypotheses are certainly well supported by the historical facts. Science did emerge out of alchemy. The question is, what were the alchemists up to? And they were trying to produce the philosopher's stone, and that was the universal medicament for mankind's pathology. Jung felt that what had happened,
we wanted to address the wrath of God and to resolve it,
was that Christianity had promised that, the cessation of suffering, promised it for 1,000 years, and yet suffering went on unabated. And at the same time, Christianity had attempted to...
And this continues to be I went to church and my problems didn't go away. But within Christianity, of course, at the center is the crucified Christ and the resurrection. But then after the resurrection, the ascension, and it's, and we're confused by the narrative.
Really put emphasis on spiritual development, let's say, at the expense of material development, right? Thinking of material development as something akin to a sin, trying to get a control of impulsivity and all the things that went along with a two-embodied existence. There was a reason for it, but that by about 1000 AD, the European mind, somewhat educated by that point, somewhat able to concentrate on a single point, perhaps because of a very long history of intense religious training, turned its dream to the unexplored material world and thought, well, the spiritual redemption that we've been seeking didn't appear to produce the result that was promised or intended, and so maybe there's another place that we should look, and that was in the damned material world, right? Which was supposed to be, at least according
Well, it's the lowest level at the bottom of the discarded image.
to some elements of classic thinking, nothing but the creation of the devil. So, but the point I'm making is that, it's very difficult to underestimate the amount of human motivation that's embedded in the attempt to alleviate suffering, to eradicate disease, to help people live a healthy life, and well, that's the disease, obviously, but to live a long life as well and to make things as peaceful as possible. I mean, you can be cynical about people and you can talk about them as motivated by power and being corrupt and all of those things are true, but you shouldn't throw away the baby with the bathwater, because we have been striving for a very long time to set things right, and we've done actually not too bad a job of it for half-starving, crazy, insect-ridden chimpanzees with lifespans of 50 to 70 years. So, we could deserve a bit of sympathy for our position as far as I'm concerned. So,
I mean, now going to dynamical systems, when they're in criticality, small differences matter in the way that they never mattered before. Very small differences. Like when civilization's sort of rumbling along, the chances that anything you or I do can make any difference are very small. But when a system becomes hypercritical, like it is now, in both senses of the word, by the way, right? Small actions can have huge differences. So I feel a tremendous responsibility. And the question that comes from me is, okay, but how can I exercise virtuosity grounded in virtue about this? Because for me, Jordan, that's the way of stepping out of the all too human repetition of the extractor function of civilization.
So again, virtue is this general revelation. It's seen beyond, obviously, but it's sort of figured out by dead reckoning from general revelation. Oh, this is the path out of the day of the Lord to glory, not out of the day of the Lord to perdition. And again, if you look at what virtue is, Pageau could jump in here and say, well, virtue has the pattern of the crucified Christ. It's the sacrifice. It's the self-denial. It's the betting on the goodness of being. This is what Jordan Peterson did with his Easter article and video back in 2018. It's the betting on the goodness of being, that my sacrifices will not be fruitless. It's taking the produce of my field and saying, I will not eat it, but I will put it in the ground. It's taking the best ears of corn as my seed corn to plant for the next generation. There's virtue.
And trying to get to something more primordial.
So there's a lot that just happened there, a number of different things. So let's see. One, I would say, the first thing that popped out very sharply for me was this phrase, did not make something up. Mm-hmm. And I think this is quite important to really focus on that. That phrase, like to make something up. For me, it speaks to that notion of golem, right? It speaks to that notion of simulation. To be sure, he did not make something up. And I would say even more powerfully, to make something up is precisely this mistake of mind taking itself to be the whole. So category error, don't do that ever. Bad idea. And so then it's like, what does it mean to simply be kind of making choices or to act in right relationship with the kairos? In some sense, that's all there is to it. So that's all we're talking about. What is it?
It is right relationship to the kairos, but it's right relationship to the source of the kairos. Because the kairos itself isn't that which we want. We don't want to live perpetually. This stuff gets so hard. But it's the maker and giver of life.
Does it mean to simply make proper choices in the context of making proper choices? And so, to express the logos with humility and integrity is very different than to make something up. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Like yes. Quite the, I would say opposite, but not even the word opposite. It's not the proper. It creates the wrong frame. It's not the word opposite isn't even part of the story. And if we think about the magnitude of the notion of creation itself in relationship with the epiphenomenon of human civilization, that which is possible in the context of simply expressing the logos properly in kairos is not a historical event. We can't sort of measure it against historical events. That's nonsense. It's like saying you can't stack 2 grains of sand upon the other. All that has happened in the long arc of human history is as nothing in relationship to the potential that is embedded in the creation itself. So,
I disagree with that, and I disagree with it confessionally. I disagree with it in terms of that. I would look again to Lewis's miracles and the grand miracle, It's the missing chapter that makes sense of the symphony, or the novel.
To the degree to which even a small number of people come to a capacity to speak the logos or express the logos with integrity and humility, then we literally have no possibility of understanding exactly what might follow, nor should we endeavor to do so. Ours is not to understand it. Ours is simply to endeavor to do it as well as we can. Again, with tremendous humility. So that's what came from me in response to that last little bit.
I think your point is very powerful. And I think that it talks about this idea too of the seed, this image, for example, of the ark is a good one, because you would think, the ark, Noah's ark, is just this little dot in an ocean of breakdown and chaos and everything falling apart. But that's it. Like that's it. That's all we can do, is to, let's say, manifest the seed, and then that will grow, with time. As the shift happens, then it really is, in a way, the only thing we can do.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I get that, but I still want to press the Socratic point, which is the virtuosity and virtue of the logos in relationship to the hyper agents. These are virtues and virtuosities that we are not properly explicating and cultivating right now in our culture, right? If putting this, like, here's the emerging ontology. This is reality saying, I'm going to break into everything you thought you made. That's what's happening, right? That's what the hyper objects and the parasitic entities are doing. And I like this idea that they're degradations of the hyper agents, the in-between. I think that's beautiful. But then, okay, how do I not exercise, is the wrong word. How do I participate in the virtuosity and virtue of logos with these aspects of my ontology, given that they are eruptions into what has been a stable ontology? The ontology is being destabilized, right? It's entering, right?
How do I live? I mean, that's basically what he's asking, is, given everything that we've noticed, given now that I have a sense of the peril that I am in. You say, well, what peril? You're sitting comfortably in an office and there's no tiger, there's no queen with a gun, but we're seeing the peril that we're in, and I want to act with virtue, and I want to know the truth, and again, I don't want to just act with virtue to sort of be a stoic hero. I want to get to the promised land too. And I want to not just get there alone. I want to get there with my friends, and I want to get there with read Isaiah 35, the way of the Lord, and, well, maybe I'll read it, because most of you probably don't know what it says. The desert and the parched land will be glad. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom. Like the crocus, it will burst into bloom. It will rejoice greatly and shout for joy. The glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the splendor of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord and the splendor of our God. Strengthen the feeble hands, steady the knees that give way. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong and do not fear. Your God will come. He will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. There's the Kairos moment. He will come to save you. Then will the eyes of the blind be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer, and the mute tongue shout for joy. Water will gush forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. The burning sands will become a pool, the thirsty ground bubbling springs, and the haunts where jackals once lay, grass and reeds and papyrus will grow. And a highway will be there. It will be called the way of holiness. It will be for those who walk in that way. The unclean will not journey on it. Wicked fools will not go about it. They won't. Others won't disrupt. Others won't disrupt. It will be protected from the kinds of disruption from our own foolishness and the foolishness of others that destroy it now. No lion will be there, no any ravenous beast. They will not be found there, but only the redeemed will walk there, and those the Lord has rescued will return. They will enter Zion with singing. Everlasting joy will crown their heads. Gladness and joy will overtake them, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. And then the next chapter is Sennacherib threatens Jerusalem.
And so, this comes up. It comes up for me in my practices.
Yeah.
Right. Like, what is it like what is it like to exercise? I keep saying exercise, to practice. That's the word I want. To practice the participation of the virtuosity and the virtues of logos with respect to the emerging aspects of the ontology. Right? That to me, like I say, this is not an abstract problem. This comes up for me in Lectio Divina. This comes up for me in philosophical fellowship. This comes up for me in dialectic into dialogos. And that's what I think I want. Like I'm sorry, I'm getting too passionate, but that's the part that I'm really.
He's getting too passionate. he's getting so passionate. He's having trouble. He's having trouble articulating the passion and the glory that seems just almost there to him.
Want to bring into prominence. We have a kind of. You might not agree with me on this, Jonathan, but to my mind, it looks like we have a profound ignorance about this. And first of all, we have to admit the ignorance. That's Socrates. And then secondly, how are we going to respond to it? How are we going to respond? Like, I'll stop.
And maybe I'll stop there too. I've been doing this for, I don't know, a couple of hours now so then maybe I'll pick this one up again because let's say I'm at 113:33. But I think this is a powerful conversation, and I think we're watching. We're very. The Kairos is upon us, and I think we're seeing transformation. I really do. The day of the Lord is doing its work, and it's a day of destruction, and it's a day of coming. So maybe this is a good time to stop. Let me know what you think in the comments.